Okay, so quick little peek behind the curtain for you all as far as why this is a bonus episode instead of a regular episode. This was kind of a late addition, and most of the other episodes, or all the rest of the other episodes this season, all the way through April, Logan and I recorded in the spring and summer of 2020, and I kind of got going through and realized we didn't have an episode on Nelson Mandela, and that just seemed like a egregious oversight that we wanted to remedy. So we were recording this episode in December just so we could include it as an important piece to our timeline here. So yeah, Logan, go ahead and tell us about the movie. Or what are we doing?
We're doing Invictus today. It's a 2009 movie directed by Clint Eastwood, starring Morgan Freeman and Matt Damon. Morgan Freeman is Nelson Mandela, and Matt Damon plays... I'm going to have to look this one up because...
Oh, I never had his name down. I just figured we would just call him Matt Damon.
Oh, yeah, I'm going to refer to him as Matt Damon throughout the episode.
Okay, which is a horrible insult to the soccer player, or rugby player. Oh, man, we're so American. Francois.
Okay, yes. So, Matt Damon plays Francois Pinar, I think is how you say that. I don't know. I'm just going to call him Matt Damon because I'm going to butcher that pronunciation.
So, apologies, Francois, if you're listening.
Yeah, and also anyone from any of the many groups that have names that we're about to butcher today. This is going to be a pretty butcher-heavy episode as far as pronunciations go.
I was just going to avoid most of them, and we got Nelson Mandela down, so we're good.
Yeah. But anyway, so it follows Nelson Mandela, and then so him kind of coming to power as the first black president in South Africa after the fall of apartheid. So this is in the early 1990s, and then it also follows the Springboks, which is the country's rugby union team, and then their journey to the 1995 Rugby World Cup.
Okay, exactly. So I wanted to set up the history that kind of leads into South Africa this time, continuing from where we last were in South Africa when we talked about Zulu starring Michael Caine. So that was in the late 1800s with the British fighting some Zulu tribes, and the Boers were kind of in the background there. So around that same time and actually a little bit before that, was when diamonds were discovered in South Africa in the 1860s. And it just blew up really quick. And by the 1870s and 1880s, 95% of the world's diamonds were coming out of South Africa. And then right around that same time, you then find gold in South Africa, and that blows up. And about a quarter of the world's gold by the 1880s was coming out of South Africa. So you have a massive amount of wealth being created in South Africa, which is, of course, going almost exclusively to the whites that are the ethnic minority in South Africa. And then you get into the Boer Wars, which many people have heard of but don't really think about what they are. Basically, you had two white groups in South Africa, because you had those of Dutch descent that came first, and then those of British descent. So there was two kind of distinct groups, and the British, as they kind of, flexed their colonial muscle, the Dutch Boers that had been there longer, don't really like the British being in charge, and so there was two wars over that, and obviously that's a gross oversimplification, but that's what we do here, and we're just kind of moving along. So it was kind of different colonies that then ultimately were united in the Union of South Africa right before World War I, and it's just this interesting situation because obviously in the United States we've had we brought over slaves and they were always an ethnic minority percentage-wise. South Africa is just this weird situation where the bulk of the population is obviously black, but then the minority population whites just control everything. So it's about 80-20 as far as blacks to white population-wise. But, in like 1913, when they're kind of, starting to draw up some of these initial laws of an actual South Africa, they earmarked just 8% of the land for black settlement or black occupancy. And the whites held 90% of the land in the country. And it's just kind of an untenable situation, but it just maintains here for a long time. Yeah, so during World War I, World War II, they obviously were fighting with the British, but what do happen is it seems like over the course of the first half of the 20th century, after the Boer Wars, the two white groups, the Boers and the British, not exactly put away their differences. There's still kind of two official languages. Afrikaans, which is the derivation of Dutch, and English are kind of the two official languages. But mostly by 1960, they've thrown off the shackles of the actual British Empire, where they had been kind of a dominion state like we'd seen with Australia and Canada and all those, and now are independently South Africa and no longer associated with the British.
Okay.
Now, what becomes just an important part of keeping South Africa on the world stage for bad is the system of apartheid, which I think a lot of people have heard of and kind of know roughly what it is. Basically, I think the best way to explain it is to compare it to the quote-unquote Jim Crow South in the United States, where you kind of had these policies centered around, whites only, this and this. The difference in South Africa is it was the entire country and it was official. So instead of just like, a few things here and there and, maybe a few kind of laws in this state and that state, it was national and they were really hardlined about it.
And it was also it was a minority control and a majority thing, which is another good it's another distinction where Jim Crow laws was a majority suppressing a minority. In this case, it was the minority whites suppressing the majority of the country, which was black.
Right, with their superior force of arms and financial resources. So the minority was fiercely suppressing through these harsh laws, and basically it was just the formalization of these racist policies that already existed. So 1948 is when they kind of really made all this stuff official, and they were just really hard. Like it was just kind of violently enforced. So all these things were not only the laws. I think probably because they were the ethnic minority, they felt they had to be extremely harsh or they would lose control.
Right.
But then the world just kind of was not okay with this. So in 1966, the UN calls apartheid a crime against humanity, and what I always kind of feel ashamed about is, they actually 91 member countries, kind of vote for the censorship of South Africa. The United States was one of 4 countries that didn't get on board with that, which, I'm sure was for largely economic reasons, because I can't think of...
Well, no, it's because the anti-apartheid movement was aligned with communist and socialist movements.
Oh, true. Okay,
so that's why the United States wasn't. That's why the United States was actually a kind of buddy with the South African government, because they were all about stamping out socialism and communism in Africa.
Right, and that actually leads to what then. Well, okay, 2 things. We'll get to the fall of apartheid here in a second. But yeah, so there was obviously then resistance from the blacks to apartheid. And initially, that was largely peaceful for a couple decades, kind of like following the Muhammad Gandhi policy. And they thought maybe they could do it kind of like the Indians did with the British. And ultimately, after that was not successful, and frankly, because the South African government was just probably way harsher than the British had been in India, with violent suppression of any protest, it got violent. And kind of to your point then it was the Soviets that did help arm the blacks against the whites in apartheid there too, which is why the fall of the Soviet Union, which you wouldn't necessarily think about as something that would help bring about the end of apartheid, was kind of the straw that broke the camel's back. So there was obviously the worldwide pressure to end apartheid, protests all over the world against apartheid, and this, again, this systematic oppression of the blacks in South Africa by the ethnic minority whites. And once the Soviet Union fell, the whites could basically no longer use the kind of boogeyman of communism as kind of this excuse to keep suppressing the blacks who they could say, well, hey, they're getting weapons from the communists, so therefore they are bad. That excuse kind of went away, and the moral high ground they could claim was gone, and apartheid collapsed. Now, well, why don't you go ahead and tell us then how Nelson Mandela himself played into this whole story.
Yeah, so Nelson Mandela, who is, one of basically the 2 main characters in this movie, he was born in South Africa in 1918. He actually grew up in like a kind of a small village, but it was relatively isolated from a lot of the apartheid-related atrocities. I mean, obviously he knew about them because he lived in South Africa, but wasn't really exposed to them very much until the 1940s. So when he was growing up, he was the son of basically like a chief of their local tribe. So he was kind of groomed for leadership. He went to law school, and then he moved to Johannesburg in the early 1940s. And that was where he was kind of like first experienced this stuff in person, these, the basically state-sanctioned racism. And so he joined the ANC, which is the African National Congress, in 1943. And it's basically a group that they're anti-apartheid, they were anti-National Party, they basically wanted to bring equality to the black population of South Africa. And so like you mentioned, they did initially start a kind of a non-violent civil disobedience type of movement with, protests, non-violent, and they were helped by, and he was also secretly joined the South African Communist Party around this time as well. But eventually, like you said, those methods just weren't effective. They weren't getting the results that they wanted. So in 1961, Mandela co-founded the militant arm of the ANC, which, and here's another one of the pronunciation butcherings, but this movement was called, or this organization was called Umkhonto we Sizwe, which it means the spear of the nation. And so that was the ANC's basically militant arm, and they carried out multiple bombings and attacks throughout the 60s, 70s, and 80s. And they actually were absorbed or integrated into the South African National Defense Force in 1994. So like these guys who were like these revolutionary militants, then after apartheid was ended and Mandela came to power, they were then officially brought into the South African military, which I think is kind of interesting.
Well, and just a quick side thing too is how, one of the first things in the movie is one of the rugby coaches calling Mandela a terrorist, and this is why.
Well, and in his mind, he was kind of justified in saying that. I mean, they did carry out bombings. They planted like landmines along roads and stuff. They did like kill some civilians. Right.
It's Battle of Algiers all over again.
Exactly. It's Battle of Algiers. It's
Wind that shakes the barley.
Wind that shakes the barley. Exactly. It's that exact thing. It's they're kind of resorting to these violent actions because they feel like they don't have any other option. And the government labeled him a terrorist. The United States even government had labeled him a terrorist at this point as well. So in 1962, he was arrested and he was sentenced to initially 5 years in prison. But then when he was in prison, they charged him with sabotage and with attempting to overthrow the government, which both of those things were technically true. Even, which obviously the government was not good. And, however, he felt that he was justified in doing those things, but technically, according to the law in South Africa or whatever, he was guilty of both of those things. But he refused to defend himself because he didn't want to legitimize the charges against him.
Oh, wow.
But he was convicted to, or he was sentenced to life in prison, and he spent 27 years in prison, mostly on Robben Island, but I think he went to a few different prisons. And you actually see that in the movie. They take a tour of the prison. They see the cell that he was in and the courtyard with the rocks and stuff. But so then in 1990, basically because domestic and international pressure forced the hand of the nationalist government, he was released, and then he was elected president in
94, I believe.
1994, right, which was the first election in which blacks were allowed to vote, and he won in a landslide.
Right. And actually, as we see that the first scene of the movie is like we talked about. It's kind of that motorcade, and they're like, "Oh, what's happening?" And it's like, "Oh, they just released that terrorist Mandela."
Yeah,
and basically,
right.
but the timing is interesting. Actually, I need to look up the exact dates. But you look at it's just crazy how it's tied to so many other world events. But if you look at the fall of the Berlin Wall, to the release of Nelson Mandela, I think it was 4 months. I mean, it's just crazy that this stuff is all, and it's not a coincidence. Like it did all to have a ripple effect around the world.
It is all connected, and that kind of ties back then to the Spear of the Nation, that group that was the militant group in South Africa. They were, doing bombings and landmine campaigns in South Africa, but they were also in other countries. They were in Angola, they were in Rhodesia, which is now Zimbabwe, fighting for like pro-Marxist and pro-socialist movements there at the same time that Che Guevara was doing the same thing, and that the Cubans were sending troops to Africa to try and prop up these socialist and communist rulers and parties and stuff that were then obviously fiercely contested by the West and by the United States. So yeah, this is kind of a lot of what we have talked about as far as the Cold War and the 20th century kind of conflict between capitalism and communism. It all ties into this story.
And I just can't help but think of all the shades of gray where Mandela is now almost universally seen as this hero and Gandhi / Martin Luther King Jr. type figure. But he's also kind of buddy-buddy with, Gaddafi and these other kind of dictators around the world that, the United States views as the bad guy. And someone like Che, who we've talked about, on the one hand, seeing him as, this guy fighting for the people, but the other hand, being willing to just straight up murder and being cruel on the other end, and even Mandela being okay with the violence that went against civilians earlier, then somehow he gets elevated to the saint status, and I'm not even saying it's unjustified. It's just so complicated, and we come back to it a million times, how we have to allow for these shades of gray. And honestly, too, you think about this, what we're seeing right now, with the cancel culture thing. And would even a Mandela today, would someone decide, oh, nope, because he murdered these civilians back here in the 60s, or not directly, but you know what I'm saying, he was on that side. You know what, we don't care about the decades of good work he did anymore, and we're now just deciding that he's canceled.
And he also, he was married 3 different times. One of his wives alleged, physical abuse.
It's complicated, right?
Exactly.
Right. And I'm saying this as someone who admires Nelson Mandela. I don't want to give the wrong impression there.
Right.
It's just, it's complicated, and I think we are too quick on all sides to just kind of want to paint people with a single color and not look at the whole picture.
For sure. Well, something else I wanted to mention, and this is kind of a sidetrack, but it'll be really quick, I promise. So something else that's interesting about the end of apartheid and the kind of ripple effect that it has on other events. So during the 1970s, South Africa actually developed a nuclear weapons program. So they had built atomic bombs, basically, that they were planning on not necessarily using, but having, if they needed to use them against any of the countries that were becoming communist around them.
Oh, so they would have been willing to nuke these neighboring African countries?
Maybe. I mean, because especially
at least
if those countries are
aligned,
right? If they're aligned with the Soviets, it's not, or even like you saw in the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962, like the Soviets were willing to hand out nuclear weapons if they thought it was gonna, get them
more friends,
get them an edge on the international stage, right? So the South Africans developed a nuclear weapons program in the 70s. They voluntarily dismantled it in 1989, and they were the first country to do so, which sounds really, really good, except for the fact that the only reason that they did that was because they could see on the horizon that there was going to be the majority black community population in their country was going to be allowed to vote, and they were afraid that a communist, probably black guy, was going to be president soon, and they didn't want that person to have nuclear weapons, so they dismantled them all in 1989.
That is fascinating. And again, talk about shades of gray and all kinds of different issues at play there.
It's like, on the one hand, nuclear non-proliferation, they were supporters of it, they got rid of all their weapons voluntarily, that's awesome. But it's because they didn't want a black person to have them.
Just so they wouldn't have to give them to the other party, basically. Yeah, wow. So it's interesting, too, and then just because it deals particularly with what we're going to talk about in the film being about this rugby run for the World Cup, there's also, what we haven't mentioned yet, there's something to be said for sports is actually one of the major driving forces for ending apartheid, along with everything else we've already said. That basically the whites in South Africa wanted to be able to play international sports again. So one of the restrictions that the world had put on them, they basically, and I don't know what year it started, but they stopped allowing South Africa to have a team at the soccer and rugby World Cups. And so you grew up watching all these teams, and all of a sudden you're ineligible because of your country's political policies. And so I think another reason they were so willing to end apartheid was so they could play sports again. That's also why the team's kind of rusty, is they hadn't played at the international level in a while.
Right. Were they banned from the Olympics as well? Do you know?
I'm going to vote yes. Honestly, just I don't know.
Oh, there's an entire Wikipedia page called Apartheid Era South Africa and the Olympics.
Oh, well, yeah, that.
Okay, so it looks like South Africa was actually banned from the Olympics. They did not compete in any Olympic Games between 1964 and 1988.
Oh, wow.
So 24 years they
were
banned because of apartheid. And basically the IOC, the International Olympic Committee, said you are not allowed to compete until apartheid is no more.
Wow. I was surprised they weren't willing to make some kiss. That's crazy for a country that is honestly, very obsessed with their sports teams. So the team was still playing, but they weren't able to compete at the international level as far as the rugby goes.
Right.
So, and then obviously we'll get to kind of accuracy stuff as we go throughout here. But generally speaking, just kind of right at the bat, this is based on a nonfiction book by John Carlin called "Playing the Enemy: Nelson Mandela and the Game That Made a Nation." And I really didn't find anything about large historical inaccuracies during the translation. Obviously, they didn't translate it perfectly, but if anything, they left things out of the book as opposed to altering things from the book. So I really couldn't find anything about major discrepancies. So I'm going to say, even though obviously no film can give the complete picture, I don't think that there is anything in this film that is just a complete fabrication. It might be a scene made to represent kind of a larger truth or events, but as far as the Watts, I think they basically get it right, and this is a pretty faithful depiction of reality, minus a few key things we'll kind of get to at the end here. So, yeah, I mean, it really is just about, the end of apartheid. Nelson Mandela gets released from prison. Then we kind of jump ahead 4 years to him getting elected president. And then basically we see, and I guess I don't know how long it was from the election to his first day at work, but that's kind of when I would say our story really starts, is his first day at work. And it's actually a very, poignant scene in that it's the new president coming into the South African version of the White House, which I don't know what that is called. But all the white office workers from the previous administration are basically packing up and heading out. And then he calls everyone in and says, I mean, you can leave if you want to leave, but don't assume I'm firing you. You guys have been working here. You know the routine. We'd love to have you stay on and serve your country.
Right. Basically, like, some of them were packing up their offices already.
Right.
Fully prepared to be fired that day. Yeah.
And honestly, so this is actually why Mandela is such an important figure, and why we wanted to make sure we included this film, is if this one person had decided to approach this whole thing differently, it would have been a completely different situation, and I don't see how massive violence would have been avoided.
Just like with his security team. So he brings in all of the white South African security guards to work with his, a couple of guys that he has who are all black. And the one guy goes in, he goes, hey, we can't have these guys around. He goes, well, they're here to protect the president. He goes, well, these guys were just trying to kill us, like, not that long ago. And he's like, yeah, well, basically, so what? Not anymore. And now we have to be unified, and this is what it means.
Right.
This isn't, just because we won doesn't mean that we get to now do, exclude anybody else. Like, we stand for unity, so we're all going to be unified.
Right. And frankly, then, the theme of this film and the theme of Mandela's life post-prison is the power of forgiveness, and that, he's going to turn the other cheek. And even though these people who have been oppressing us for decades and murdering us in the streets, we're going to say, you know what? Now that we're in charge, we forgive you.
Right.
And it's just like, and basically unilaterally. And then, of course, then again, that gets to the rugby thing. They show the scene. Now, this is a scene where I can't imagine this played out exactly how we see it, but I'm guessing something similar happened. they voted to eliminate the white rugby team that they just saw as a symbol of the oppression of the whites over the blacks, even the green and yellow colors and everything. They're like, we're going to get rid of this team. We'll still have rugby. We're going to make a new team, new mascot, new colors and everything. And Mandela talks them out of it and says, I know you disagree with me on this, but it is so important that we basically extend this olive branch that we know how important this rugby team is to you all. And we're gonna keep it, and I'm gonna try to convince my people to get behind it, even though they can't stand to look at the green and yellow.
And even more than that, they then basically kind of like co-opt it and turn it into a symbol then for like their movement and their ideals.
Right.
You know, basically everyone, the black South Africans kind of viewed it as a symbol of nationalism and oppression, and then Mandela turned it into, well, in the movie, turns it into this symbol of national unity instead.
Right, without alienating the whites who still continue to support the team.
Exactly.
And this is an image I'd probably seen, before this movie ever came out, but it's Mandela wearing the green and yellow of the Springboks, and that was huge.
Right.
Huge. This beloved, newly elected leader who has spent 27 years in prison fighting for the rights of blacks in South Africa is now wearing what is seen as the symbol of the oppressor in an effort to unite the country and recognize their common heritage as South Africans, and that the racial stuff was no longer important. And that wasn't now that the blacks are in charge, it's not going to be the whites dominating the blacks. It's like, no. Now the blacks are in charge, it's going to be everyone's equal. And he was just going to fight for that tooth and nail.
You also see this with the flags. So at the beginning of the movie, the flags that you see a lot of people, even though South Africa, apartheid was over, South Africa had a new flag in 1994. The flag that you know today, it's pretty iconic. But you see a lot of people still waving the old flag, basically as a kind of not so subtle dog whistle that, hey, we don't support the new South Africa. But then at the end of the movie, you see more people, everyone's waving the actual South African flag. And there's actually a scene in the movie where Nelson Mandela goes out of his way to go talk to a white guy in the crowd at a rugby game and thank him for flying the new South African flag.
Yes, which is, kind of a neat moment. So basically, we don't really get into a lot of the politics outside of just Mandela's obsession with the rugby thing as a symbol, but it was significant. Again, this did happen. This was kind of something he latched onto as important for the country, and we do see the team go from, now again, I haven't looked up the details of how bad they actually were and getting good this quick, because, as a sports person, that seems a big change for not a lot of change on the roster.
Right. It seems unlikely that they went from this, we could, pretty much suck, we're the worst, and then they played, at the end, they played the All Blacks from New Zealand that are, setting scoring records against other international teams, and they win.
Right, but at the end of the day, they did, and...
and I know that actually happened, but...
No, it's just crazy. It is a crazy underdog story that almost because it's about these bigger issues, the pure sports side of it, you almost don't really realize how big a deal that is. That New Zealand was this unstoppable juggernaut coming to the host country, South Africa, who only qualified because they were the host country. Otherwise, they weren't even getting into the tournament.
Exactly.
It's almost like they get a token spot and then still win it all against this juggernaut All Black team from New Zealand. Yeah, it's a huge Cinderella story that, again, is almost kind of lost in the idea of just oh, hey, wouldn't it be neat if for our country that is kind of newly altered, that it would help unite us if we won? And then you need the biggest upset in the history of sports, basically, to pull that off. And that is so... not focused on in the sports way. It's everything's about symbolism in this film, and we get that the win is a big deal symbolically, but the nuts and bolts of making this sports win happen just seem astronomically unlikely. And I guess I really didn't research into. I think we show them kind of buckling down, getting more serious, and again, I guess we get serious anyway too if all of a sudden you now do have an international level to play out, which you previously had not been allowed.
Right.
Honestly, maybe they were never that bad. It was more just kind of disunion and not having played at the world stage for a while. So maybe the potential was always there, because again, they don't really change the roster. They change the coaches.
Right. Well, and that's kind of what we see in the movie.
Right.
I mean, you see them like, I don't know, maybe working out like a little bit harder, but mostly it's just because they kind of decide that, okay, we're going to like actually be serious about this now. And then they turn out to be really, really good.
And a key point, though, that I actually do buy into, and it was probably, to me, it's kind of the emotional highlight of the movie, is when the country says, oh, hey, in addition to your schedule with all the press and all the practices and preparing for the World Cup, we're also going to make you go and do these clinics all around the country where you basically will teach rugby to the poor black kids. And they're just like, we don't have time for this. You want us to play well, and our schedule's full enough. We're just not interested. And they're like, yeah, we're not asking. You're doing this.
Right. Well, and then it turns out that the inspiration they get from that was worth more than like
exactly
any of the practices.
Exactly. And I do think there is something to that there's if you get into the sports psychology side of things, you go from feeling like you're representing a country that no longer actually supports you to, oh no, we've met the kids on the ground who grew up basically, playing soccer and ignoring rugby because rugby was the white people's sport, to now the little black kids are, supporting the Springboks and okay with the green and the yellow when they see Mandela wear it. And they're like, okay, rugby's cool. And oh, hey, we've actually met these players. And then also what the players get out of that of, oh, these are just kids and we're having a blast playing rugby with these kids. And who cares that their parents grew up hating us? These kids, this is a new generation. This is a new beginning. And then I think the weight of that in a positive way is with them when they're playing these World Cup games. I think it really does matter. It really, really does. And again, we've kind of already said it, they do ultimately win the World Cup championship, and Mandela is able to present the trophy to Matt Damon.
Yes.
Francois Pinard or whatever. And now, it is a solid movie. And what I wanted to kind of then jump into is, so the immediate aftermath, the questions I wanted to ask ourselves was, did it work? Was the country unified? Was Mandela successful? And it's kind of both. So kind of yes, like it did work. He did get the blacks to ultimately support the Springboks. And when the country won, it was a shared moment of euphoria that the country shared. But it was short-lived because ultimately that doesn't actually solve any problems. And so it was both. So it's not as simple as the movie makes it seem, like, racism is over in South Africa. It's now a utopia. It's like, well, no. They shared a great moment, a sincere moment that did unite them for that victory. But then all the problems that were still existing on the ground with the whites controlling the economy and all of that, those were still issues. Nothing actually changed fundamentally other than, hey, now we might, we have this shared South Africanness that we can focus on a little bit. And it was definitely a good thing. It was definitely worth doing, which is why I'm going to say, yes, ultimately Mandela was successful. And this established, what he saw as what the spirit of this country should be going forward. But it's just as far as people's day-to-day lives weren't fundamentally changed by this victory. Which, again, shouldn't be a surprise to anyone. But, the movie kind of makes it seem like we're ending on this high note and everything's now good forever. The long-term aftermath, so it's okay. I don't know. It's rough. Honestly, South Africa is still a country with a lot of corruption and a lot of crime. Yep.
Unemployment's still really high.
Right.
Arguably, racial disparity is a big issue.
Right. It rates as one of the most xenophobic countries in the world as far as how they view outsiders. Yeah.
Yeah. The HIV AIDS pandemic hit South Africa really, really hard.
Right. And Mandela took a lot of flack for not doing enough about it, which I even had in my notes. He did admit, actually, post-presidency, he did a lot more for HIV/AIDS and kind of said he did drop the ball on it just because South Africans as a people were just too skittish and hesitant to talk about anything related to sex. And so it was just a conversation the nation wasn't willing to have, and they kind of let that uncomfortableness exacerbate the problem, frankly. Yes, Mandela did a lot of good. He did what he could in a country where these things were tough to accomplish. And I would say he did move the needle. And
and I was going to say maybe, he moved the needle, but there's a lot to be said too for like the things that didn't happen that like could have happened had someone else, but like potentially there could have been a full-on, civil war, or
there could have been full-on genocide of the whites if you had the wrong person in charge.
Something like we saw in Hotel Rwanda.
Right, absolutely.
Kind of like, oh, well, we're in power now, and we're the majority, so guess what we're going to do? It's bad news for white people in South Africa now.
Right.
Like, that could have definitely happened. Right,
and you're right, and it didn't. And so the biggest things they ended up fighting were things like, well, obviously the problems that previously existed with, the wealth disparity, but also they had a big issue of, well, basically they called it brain drain, because obviously the whites were more educated because they had all the money, and then when the blacks are allowed to take, again, so it's disingenuous to say, the quote, the blacks took over. It's like, no. The blacks were allowed to vote, and then so that drastically increased the odds of black officials getting elected. So it wasn't the blacks taking over; it was the blacks are now allowed to vote, and now the voices of the country are now actually being heard. But so then a lot of the whites then just straight up left the country, and so a lot of people who were highly educated and highly qualified in certain industries, etc., just literally left the country and were like,
which
is
whatever. Something that we saw in Lumumba.
Exactly.
Which is all the white Belgians basically either they wanted to leave or they said, oh, well, who else here is college educated that would like to, take over this government position or this, high military position? Oh, no one, because we haven't allowed any of you to go to college for the last however many years? Okay, I guess I'm still going to keep my power then.
Right. So when Mandela took office, there's about 40 million people in South Africa. 23 million, so more than half, lacked electricity or adequate sanitation, and a third of the population was illiterate. So that was the world he was inheriting.
Which is insane. For 1994, a third of your country's illiterate. That's crazy.
And a country that, again, the country, there was money in the country, but the people didn't have it.
Right.
And just talk about, the disparity. So he was coming into basically he was given an impossible task. So you're right. He was a success, but it was also a position where, it was an impossible task, and he did the best with it, and did ultimately succeed by avoiding some of the things that, like you said, had happened in other parts of Africa. And so also, he was extremely popular, he won in a landslide, but did not seek re-election. He was also pretty old. He was 76 when he got elected, so by the end of his term, it was a 5-year term, he was already in his early 80s. He did not seek re-election, and initially planned to retire, but kind of got bored, and then he kind of came back and was doing a lot of just, meetings and traveling the world and just kind of doing charity stuff, and actually, like I said, started working more on the AIDS issue, and just was a very public figure. And obviously that's when I kind of got to know him more. I guess I would have been in high school when he got elected president, but, kind of then through college, I was hearing him do all these other things. Then at one point, though, I think in 2004, he did, quote, retire from retirement because he's getting old. He wasn't in the best of health, and had a lot of lung issues and prostate issues and things like that, which I think we even see a little bit in the movie. Ultimately, then he did die in 2013 at the age of 95. And the country itself, again, it struggles, frankly. Like, they have issues with crime, but it's in an interesting boat, because South Africa is by no means what we would think of as a third world country, but at the same time, is it maybe comparable to a Brazil? That feels like just like a good comp, where there's a lot of corruption, there's a lot of poverty, but it's also a very powerful country on the world stage. Is that maybe a fair comp?
Sure, yeah. As illustrated in the 2009 documentary District 9.
Yeah!
I'm obviously joking, but like at the same time, that movie does kind of do a good job of illustrating, showing both the, the first worldness of their government and their upper class is pretty similar to like what a normal middle class American life would be, but there's also like abject poverty.
Right. And I think we take that for granted in the United States. As much issues that we have, and we do have, poverty and hunger issues too, but not to the extent that you see in places like Brazil or South Africa. And yeah, we do want to definitely plug District 9 if you haven't seen it. It's a really good film set in South Africa.
Right. Really, any Neil Blomkamp movie.
Actually, I'm not familiar with other. What are some others? I don't even know.
Did you see Elysium? I don't actually know if that takes place in South Africa or not. It mostly takes place
No, but isn't that Matt Damon?
Yeah.
Hey!
And Chappie. Did you see Chappie?
No.
It's the robot guy. I don't know. Hugh Jackman's in it.
Okay.
Anyway.
Okay.
That one does take place in South Africa.
Okay. Okay. So I did want to read a quote here from Nelson Mandela. Because, again, he was ultimately seen as, again, we kind of, talked about the shades of gray with, his life and personality, but he is ultimately widely regarded just, this important positive figure for not just South Africa, but the world. And so here's a quote from 1994. So this is, right as he's getting elected president. I thought it just kind of encompasses a lot of what we're talking about with this situation. So he said, I was first and foremost an African nationalist fighting for our emancipation from minority rule and the right to control our own destiny. But at the same time, South Africa and the African continent were part of the larger world. Our problems, while distinctive and special, were not unique, and a philosophy that placed those problems in an international and historical context of the greater world and the course of history was valuable. I was prepared to use whatever means necessary to speed up the erasure of human prejudice and the end of chauvinistic and violent nationalism. And I just think that beautifully said by Mr. Mandela, and just crazy that 27 years later, how I think poignant that sentiment still is, especially as we've seen in the last 5 years, a rise in nationalism throughout the world. And, we want to kind of recognize it's one thing to be proud of your country. It's a dangerous thing to be violently passionate about how your country is the best and other countries suck.
Right.
Or the elements within your own country who don't think you're the best are somehow dangerous to your country's survival.
Patriotism good, nationalism bad.
There you go. That's a good distinction. Okay, so and before we kind of button this up by talking about the film itself, I wanted you to talk. You had done some research on rugby, so I'm a big American football fan, and I have a rough idea from watching this movie about how rugby kind of works, but see if you can spell it out for me.
Oh, I was lost in all the rugby scenes. I mean, I kind of know like.
Right, it seems like it's nonstop, and how do you not have pads? And yeah,
right. And this is like the only thing, like the only reason that I even knew remotely what was going on is because I know like American football.
Oh, true. That's
American
true. You're right.
It is kind of like it's heavily influenced by rugby because rugby was first.
Okay.
But, I mean, for the most part, I was like, "What?" Now they're throwing this guy up in the air, and they're like, the one guy's rolling the ball, and why are they all in this kind of like weird formation, pushing each other around? I didn't understand it.
It almost looks like American football without the forward pass. Seems to be close.
So yeah, without just like going into a super long dissertation about the boring rules of rugby because there's a lot of them. So there's actually two kinds of rugby league and rugby union, which anyone who like knows anything about rugby is probably just going to be laughing at us this entire time because this
is just you giving me the Cliff's Note. Yeah.
3-year-old stuff. So rugby union is what we see played in the movie. It's the most common type of rugby in the world. Rugby was first started in like the mid 19th century, beginning of the 19th century. It originated in the UK, which is why they play it in South Africa and also all over the world because imperialism. It's so two teams with 15 players on the field at a time. There's 8 forwards and 7 backs, which is where you get kind of the, like in American football, we have backs as well. There is no forward passing, so you try to advance the ball down the field. You can pass laterally and behind you, and it has cards like soccer. So, like if like a roughing the person kind of thing, yeah, right. So, like if like in American football, there's like flags. Right. Rugby has cards, red and yellow cards, like soccer. So the way that you score, there's 3 main ways to score. The first way is called a try, which is where you get the ball past the try line, which is essentially the end zone, and you touch the ball down on the ground. Just like in American football, we have a touchdown. Okay, that's kind of cool. Okay, yeah. Touchdown is I touch the ball down on the ground. Okay, right. Nice. Then after you score a try, you can score a conversion. So a try is worth 5 points. A conversion is worth 2 points. And you do that by place kicking the ball through the uprights. So it's like the extra point.
So very similar there. So
Right.
that's actually very similar. And again, I guess if football came from rugby, that kind of makes sense. Yeah.
Right. Then the other way is either on like a penalty kick. So they have penalty kicks just like in soccer. A penalty kick, or at any time during the game, you can drop kick it, basically drop the ball onto the ground and kick it through the uprights, and that gets you 3 points.
Technically still allowed in American football, but it doesn't happen. And Doug Flutie did it like 25 years ago or 10 or 15 years ago, and it was like the first time it had been done in like 50 years. When he did it. Yeah.
Right.
Anyway.
But it's like a common thing in rugby.
Right. In rugby, it's normal. Yeah. Okay.
Right. So there's a couple of other big things to mention. One is called the scrum. So it's basically anytime there's like a stoppage and they come back, there's it's in the movie or anytime you see.
Oh, is that okay? So that's the biggest thing on rugby I've never understood. So that's basically, it's almost like a tip off in a basketball game.
It's like a tip off or like a face off in hockey. Yeah.
But you do but you do it basically at every dead ball.
Right. So
there is no possession like in American football.
Right. So they all kind of like interlock their heads and they're pushing each other, and someone from the side rolls the ball in the middle, and using their hands and feet they try to push the ball out either side.
Okay. So does the ref put the ball in? Who does the ref put the ball underneath the scrum?
No, it's one of the players. So that's
how do they decide
like,
which team? Because it would get strategic then, right?
It's dependent on the situation. So I think depending on how the scrum, like how it was initiated,
who had it last or who scored last or whatever. Okay.
Right. Yeah.
Oh, so in theory you could score, and so after a score, do they go straight to a scrum or do they kick it off like in football?
No, I think they kick it off because it has kickoffs like football too.
Okay. Yeah. Okay, yeah, the scrum is the only thing I never understood.
People that actually know the rules are just pulling their hair out right now.
No, they think this is adorable.
Right. And then the other thing that we see in the movie that I thought was kind of crazy, and I don't know if they have this in any other sports, the closest thing that I can think of is like an inbounds pass in basketball. It's kind of like an inbounds pass in soccer, but more organized, and they call it a line out. Basically, so a line out is anytime you go out of bounds. The team that was the offending team, the other team gets to pass it in, so they have one guy throwing it in, and they line up basically in two parallel lines next to the guy, and the dude throws the ball up over the top of these two parallel lines, and they jump up in the air, and you're allowed to lift players in the air to try and grab it. So that's where you see the two lines of guys, and they're like, one dude will jump up, and his teammates will literally throw him, like, pick him up and hold him like 10 feet in the air, and he will reach up and get the ball. That's called a line out, and that's another thing that's like similar to like an inbounds pass, but like obviously you don't see people throwing dudes in the air in basketball or anything. It's kind of like
that's kind of unique to rugby, but at the same time you could almost see things like that working if they were allowed in American football or basketball or something, where I mean, imagine like if in basketball you could just like throw a player up by the goal.
Yeah,
that'd be kind of crazy. What I couldn't help but thinking though too is this the evolution and how you do see it's almost like you would see with like two similar languages that are a common root. In history, you could totally see the common roots of you think of soccer and football, American football. Sorry,
right.
From our outside the U.S. listeners, and rugby. And how these things would have evolved and end up separate. And I do find that fascinating.
But then even stuff like we were talking about, how that's, the line out is similar to like an inbounds pass in basketball, or the
right. You take these elements.
Scrum is kind of it's like a face off, or in hockey, or a tip off in basketball. So you do see like this super old sport has carryover into sports that then were invented later.
Right. Or again, it's basically think back to say at some point in the 1840s, there were, kids playing a game that was, basically not really football, not really rugby, not really soccer, but also kind of all three without necessarily, there was just the game they played on the playground that day. You know what I'm saying? And like and then these things get codified. And it is kind of neat how they then become established, and now there are the official rules of rugby and the official rules of the NFL, and they're very different sports. But at the end of the day, they came back to games that were just being played, and that's all it is. It's just we kind of make up rules to make things fair, and then those rules change. And then this group over here is making different rules. I think it's so much like a language as far as you can see the commonalities here, but then the differences here as they evolved over time. And I don't know. Right. I find that kind of stuff fascinating.
Yeah. And the other thing, too, is kind of like with football, with rugby, it's like it was designed with the different positions. So with the forwards and the backs, it was designed so that, if you're like, a great big guy, but like you're not very fast, well, you can play rugby. You can be like a forward. If you're like, you're a little guy, so you're not like super powerful, but you're crazy fast, you can be a back. You're good at kicking, you can play rugby. You're good at running, you can play rugby. It was kind of designed so that no matter what your strength or your body type was,
all the guys can play.
You could play, yeah.
Right. Whereas soccer, goalie for the big guy, but you don't basically, but
right.
Yeah.
But you don't, right. You don't see any like, 6'7", 350-pound dudes playing soccer, but they're all over the place in rugby.
Right. So it's similar, I guess, American football is similar too, as far as, the whole different types of players for different skills, and rugby has that as well. And then, so what's interesting too is, so obviously the rugby guys are wearing far less equipment, but little to no padding.
Right. No helmets. Mouth guards basically is it.
Right. So a couple things on that. So Lou Holtz, who was the coach for Notre Dame for a long time, was kind of this. I haven't heard about this recently, but even like 20 years ago, was basically saying like, I don't think he was necessarily advocating for this, but he was throwing it out there that removing the helmets from American football would actually help because it changes the way you play. And so that by overprotecting players, you now see yourself as just this, I'm just a projectile.
I think there's research that backs that up too. Like
right.
The better that helmets have gotten, basically you can
more
take
concussions
like
you get.
Slightly, right. You can take slightly worse or slightly not as hard hits over and over and over again, and that's what gives you the long-term brain damage.
Right.
It's kind of like where they talk about, like boxers versus MMA fighters, where the more padding you have on the gloves, it's actually, you're more likely to get the brain damage.
Right. Boxing's actually arguably more dangerous than MMA, and
right.
NFL football is actually arguably more dangerous than rugby.
Right.
Anyway, there's a little tangent on sports, which we both dig. So Invictus. So the movie itself, it's really solid. It only got 2 Oscar nominations for Morgan Freeman as lead actor and Matt Damon as supporting actor. It's a 76% on Rotten Tomatoes. And I think all that's about right. This isn't a great film, but there's also nothing necessarily wrong with it. Like, I can't say like, oh, here are its flaws. It's more just maybe not telling that grand or an original of a story film-wise. So I can see why maybe it didn't get the Best Picture nomination, or it's not like a 90%, but it's solid. I can't think of anything really objection. Maybe it's just predictable, I guess. You can understand from the beginning, they're not going to make this movie unless they either win it all or, lose it close, Rocky style at the end.
And like the performances are good, but they're not groundbreaking. Like, Morgan Freeman and Matt Damon are both doing accents, and that's about the highest like wow factor you get from either one of their performances.
Right. Right. Yeah. It's not hugely emotional within the character. Like as emotional as this stuff could be, we don't see these emotional scenes or these big, throw down fight scenes, like verbally. Like there's not really a lot of conflict, I guess, in the movie.
Right.
Which is ironic given the amount of tension that there should be. It's almost like it's almost Eastwood's version of a Disney movie in some ways. Like
kind of.
You could definitely make a harsher version of this. But again, it's also it would be a big story. It almost needs to be a whole series, honestly, with the whole apartheid leading into this kind of stuff. I don't know.
Right. So with the measuring stick of would this be better as a 10-part Netflix series? I think for sure. Right.
Stealing from the Rewatchables podcast. Yes, yeah. I think definitely it would be better done if you took your time and spelled it out and kind of did the whole season as a whole series, the rugby season, that is. The film title, Invictus. So it's Latin for unconquerable, but specifically it's the name of a poem by 19th century English writer William Ernest Henley. He wrote a poem called Invictus that Mandela read while in prison, and it really helped inspire him. And I think you kind of hear the voiceover in the movie. And I don't know if they make it really super clear in the movie, but the voiceover you hear, it's not Mandela's own words, it's Mandela reading that poem. So I actually we've kind of gone long enough out here already, but it's not a long poem. I do want to go ahead and read the whole poem, but what I really, really want everyone to do is just think about Nelson Mandela's experience, and you can really, really see why this poem would resonate so much with Nelson Mandela while he was in prison, thinking about, trying to free his country from oppression and all those kinds of things. So here's the poem, Invictus. Out of the night that covers me, black is the pit from pole to pole, I thank whatever gods may be for my unconquerable soul. In the fell clutch of circumstance, I have not winced nor cried aloud. Under the bludgeonings of chance, my head is bloody but unbowed. Beyond this place of wrath and tears looms but the horror of the shade, and yet the menace of the years finds and shall find me unafraid. It matters not how strait the gate, how charged the punishments with the scroll. I am the master of my fate. I am the captain of my soul. So yes, basically just despite the outside forces on my life, at the end of the day, I decide. I mean, that's a powerful sentiment. Again, it's for being written in the 1870s. That's something I think people can, find a way to apply to their own lives today. And so you can definitely see, an imprisoned Nelson Mandela taking solace in that and saying like, nope. And then when he gets out of prison, how again his response is forgiveness. I don't know. I see a connection there. I think it's a great title. I think it's a great poem. all the connecting threads are pretty neat there.
Absolutely.
Okay. Final thoughts.
It's pretty good. Go watch it.
Yeah, there you go.
But definitely you'll get more out of it. I think you'll get more out of it if you watch a 5 or 10 minute YouTube video about the rules of rugby first and then go watch it.
True, because it's almost like Quidditch if you don't know anything about rugby.
Yeah, right. When the rugby's going on, it's like, ooh, this looks exciting. I don't know what's happening, but good thing in the movie though that they keep showing the scoreboard so you can understand if they're winning or losing.
I'd be curious to hear a South African or a British person or someone who's grew up watching rugby. Is the rugby in the film any good, or is this just because remember it's Eastwood and Damon and all these guys who don't even know the sport. They didn't grow up. They don't know rugby. So is it actually crappy rugby that we're seeing on screen because we don't know any different? Because I know sometimes, American football's bad half the times if the Hollywood people don't know about American football. So I wouldn't be surprised if it's really bad rugby. So yeah, let us know if it's not up to snuff. So yes, thanks for indulging us here today and throwing in this episode at the relative last minute for us. And we'll get back to our regularly scheduled program next Tuesday.